So in 1938, Lionel Wendt had a one-man show of his photographs at the Camera Club in London. Despite having only formally committed to being a photographer in 1933, Wendt had already had his work included in numerous salons internationally, 8 in total by 1936 in America alone. Simultaneously, his work was being published in foreign publications. His colleague, Bernard Thornley, would write in 1949, after Wendt's death in 1944, that Wendt's participation in these international salons was mostly a result of his own determination, personally sending out his own photographs. Thornley clarifies that Wendt, and I quote, did not enter exhibitions as a matter of course, but more as balance d'essai, to satisfy his belief that his standard was high enough for the particular salons he considered the best on photographic appreciation. And occasionally, he would enjoy a joke at the cost of a panel of judges by sending in 2 sets of prints of entirely different characters under 2 names, those sent under his own name being in his own unique style, and the other being different in an indefinable way. The outstanding example was a famous London show, which rejects his own prints, but accepted 1 or 2 of those on which his name appeared backwards, end quote. Wendt himself articulated his own skepticism of the salon of the time, and, as I quote, glorification of technique for technique's sake, and its apparent acceptance of a tradition as to what is not suitable subject for pictorial treatment, end quote. Wendt's position and acts of subterfuge give an insight into the continued prominence of the salon in the early half of the 20th century as a platform for the exhibition of photography, and how it, through its own narrow selection criteria, exerted considerable influence on what kind of work would be exhibited and circulate in the public domain. Keeping this historic context in mind, Wendt's solo show at the Camera Club can be regarded as remarkable, because not only was it an exhibition taking place outside the domain and authority of the established salon, but it proved the opportunity for a distinct body of work whose modernist style and sensibility stood in complex dialogue with then prevailing artistic practices. Ernst Litz, the manufacturer of the miniature Leica camera, was the one who facilitated the London exhibition for Wendt, an honor that he had only previously bestowed on one other living photographer. The show took place in April 1938 at the Camera Club, which was a private members' club of amateur photographers and enthusiasts. The exhibition in itself included 54 enlargements made from Leica's small negatives and was rightly representative of the breadth of Wendt's output. It included images of Sri Lanka's landscape, traditional monuments, people engaged in architectural labor, studio portraits, experimental composite pictures, and a self-portrait. Manel Fonseca, who has done incredibly important research on Wendt, has written of the show's reception that, and I quote, it aroused considerable interest, not only for its creative and original subject treatment, but also for its superb technical quality. His enlargements were found to be remarkably free from grain, and even though some of them had a linear magnification of about 30x, end quote. Morris Latham, the club's current historical archivist, informed me that the club's premises were bombed during World War II, and all the archival material documenting the club's activities pre-1939 have been lost. However, he was able to find the following quote from the May 1938 issue of the Miniature Camera magazine that reads, and I quote, during the month of April, there has been on view at the Camera Club an exhibition of Leica photographs taken by Mr. Lionel Wendt of Colombo, a very interesting one-man exhibition covering a range of subjects. It is noted that Mr. Wendt used slow and fine-grained type of panchromatic film developed in Rodinal. Development was carried out at a temperature from 80F to 85F after pre-hardening in Ilford tropical hardener, end quote. As it is clear from both Fonseca's research and the mention in the Miniature Camera magazine, more attention was paid to Wendt's technical skills than the actual content of the photographs, which were deemed interesting. Fortunately, images of the actual exhibition installation have survived. It is unclear if Wendt himself took these photographs, but they give us a fairly good idea of which specific images were exhibited. As mentioned earlier, the range and innovation of Wendt's practice was on full display at the Camera Club, and many of these images today can be identified, such as Portrait of Miss Sri Pathamantan, Torso of a Youth, Garden in Retrospect, Untitled Headless Nude Woman's Torso, and Opiate Dreams, to name a few. So what we see from this selection is that we have work done in the studio and darkroom, images shot in plein air and outdoors. Again, it is uncertain who made the selection for the show, but I would like to wager that it was primarily Wendt, maybe in consultation with someone at Leica. What the installation images telegraph, at least to me, is that the show was quite densely hung, and photographs were not clustered into discrete groups corresponding to different genre types that it would seem Wendt might have been exploring, following conventional modes of categorization that would have applied to such exotic material at the time. Instead, for example, as you can see in this installation image, we have a nude portrait of a woman hanging alongside a detailed image of an architectural relief and a communal festival scene. The intent behind the grouping is not to typify according to classification, but rather convey that this is a body of work which is not ethnographic or meant to be objective documentation of a non-Western culture, but rather they are a group of images made by a photographer that are reflective of his own interests and personal inclinations, and representative of the multifarious references and cultural context that he was navigating. This is not to propose that there is no dialogue being initiated between the images and that they were hung arbitrarily. It could be suggested that Wendt's gesture of including his own self-portrait in the exhibition, seen here right at the end, alongside two composite experimental images, Untitled Headless Nude Woman's Torso and Opiate Dreams, announces his intent, which is where photography is treated quite distinctly from what were then the accepted professional and aesthetic standards of 19th century photographic practices that either lens Sri Lanka in picturesque or ethnographic terms. Wendt, it seems, at least I think so, wants to foreground his own artistic approach and the potential that the medium of photography itself could provide for personalized artistic expression. His exhibition was not simply an archive of the people, monuments, and landscapes of Sri Lanka, but rather an assemblage of studied compositions that mix technical skill with artistic vision. At this juncture, it might be necessary to briefly dwell on how Wendt's distinct artistic expression came to form itself. Born in Colombo in 1900 into the Burgher community, a tiny minority in Sri Lanka descended from Dutch and Portuguese colonialists, he came from a privileged background and was schooled in England at Cambridge University and the Royal Academy of Music, where he studied law and classical music respectively. The time in Europe was instructive for Wendt, where he familiarized himself with the modern movements in painting. He was also drawn to English, American, and French literature, from the late Romantic poets to modernists such as Marcel Proust, Bernard Shaw, T.S. Eliot, and James Joyce. Wendt consciously chose to return to Sri Lanka in 1924, which Fonseca acknowledges as, and I quote, commencement of his adult professional life, but also suggests a commitment to his country and an eagerness to intervene in its society, art, and culture. On his return, Wendt barely practiced as a lawyer and gave a few recitals as a pianist, and did attempt painting. But from 1928 to 1932, and as Sharmini mentioned, quite crucially devoted most of his energies towards becoming a significant enabler of the modern art movement in Sri Lanka. He was the chief organizer of Group 43, a collective of modernist artists and intellectuals, a collaborator on Basil Wright's 1934 film Song of Ceylon, the co-founder of the Photographic Society of Ceylon in 1935, and 1938 established Chitra Photo, a high-quality modern photographic studio for the Associated Newspapers of Ceylon. He also contributed articles to newspapers in which he would voice his disapproval of official art in Britain and Sri Lanka, and wrote a fortnightly page on photography for the Observer's pictorials. And one particular column, when reviewing an issue of photography, expresses his own opinion, and I quote, "If you have been brought up in the pictogram tradition, you will be shocked. If you have no tradition, you will be excited. Here are photographs. The camera origin is not denied, not hushed and hidden away, like something not quite nice. Here is the camera producing art in the true sense. Here is the beauty, the true beauty of expression, where the beauty is not necessarily inherent in the object that stimulated the expression. The beauty lies in the perfection of the communication of a feeling," end quote. What needs to be highlighted is that despite his privilege and exposure to the West and an interest in the avant-garde movements of the 1920s, Wendt remained connected, invested, and committed to Sri Lanka. As Sonal Kuller has stated, and I quote, that the terms regional, alternative, vernacular, and non-Western do not adequately describe Wendt's modernist style. Such terms provincialize the cosmopolitanism of his endeavor. They overstate his difference from the Western art and understate his identification with world culture, end quote. Wendt's cosmopolitanism and his active arbitration between East and West are crucial to recognize when appraising his work. The selection of images from the 1938 show stand a testament to this kind of calibration he was engaged with, where experiments in solarization of photo montage that refer to Man Ray, European surrealism, neoclassicism, sit side by side images that document the social traditions of Sri Lanka. And neither type of image is given preferential treatment in the display. Take, for instance, this installation image. If we look closely, there are two images of a musician, one more distant, the other nearer, and sandwiched between them is a close-up portrait of a dancer's face. Here the local performer is documented, his skill recorded for the archive, but he is also thought of and pictured in a humane manner, up close, simply the expression of his commanding face. Besides the photographs of these performers is one of the laboring bodies of agricultural workers. Their labor bestowed a grandeur and a dignity by Wendt. The bodies are the focus of the image, the graceful contour of their bent back glistening, the musculature of their buttocks on display. Beyond the social concern these images express, more personal and subliminal negotiations seem to be taking place as well. An obvious homoeroticism is evident in these images of men and others in the exhibition as well. Little actual detail is known about Wendt's personal life, but his homosexual impulses have been alluded to as such by his good friend George Keat, whom he shared a very close relationship with, and has mentioned, and I quote, "He was always in a state of conflict, and homosexuality, though a driving urge, did not satisfy him." The photographs are not vulgar. Instead, they're representative of, as Robert Aldrich surmises, the pleasure for a spectator, and I quote, "Gazing at those standing in front of his camera, and by extension, the viewer looking at the photograph, a complicity in the appreciation of the aesthetic beauty of young men's bodies. Wendt may have avoided taking photographs implying sexual excitement or suggesting sexual play or intercourse as lacking in artistic value or too blatant, too vulgar or too provocative. Or perhaps his inclination ran to fantasy more than fornication, end quote. Whatever the case, the images are charged by Wendt's own gaze, but it is one which is not only determined by his sexuality. It is one which is further complicated by his being mixed race, a burgher who constituted a part of the country's elite but was part of an ethnic minority. The curator Kuroda Reiji eloquently summarizes that, and I quote, owing to his in-between position and his use of photography as an apparatus, that is the very modern spirit, cruelly to locate the viewer away from his subject, he had a longing for the communities of his country to which he was not allowed to return or belong, and a sense of melancholy that could not fulfill his longing, end quote. So what makes Wendt's images compelling are the way in which they themselves become manifestations of ways of transacting with Western influences, complicated by other sympathies and struggles, all individuated by one's own personal gaze, while ascending to levels of technical virtuosity. Due to time constraints, I'm unable to do more detailed analysis of the actual images, keeping my comments slightly more broader. The fact that these images were gathered together and were on display in 1938 in London can be marked as significant because it firstly is a demonstration coming from the non-West, particularly South Asia, of a medium's potential at a time when photography itself was not regarded in the way it is now, contesting expected norms of what qualifies as accomplished photography. And secondly, it becomes a moment of confrontation of an artistic identity and modernist art practice that is emphatically relational, where neither national or the international, the private or the public supersede one another, but are all in continual complicated engagement with one another. Wendt was, however, not the only photographer from the region who had met with international exposure. Lala Deen Dayal from India had secured quite a reputation for himself, and the success of his studio can be attributed to the fact that the work was much more in line with the tastes of a European clientele. However, closer in spirit to Wendt at this historic moment, I would wage, and active in the region was Amrita Shergill, who was navigating similar terrain personally as well as professionally. And there was, of course, her father, Umrar Singh Shergill. And we can also think of Wendt in relation to someone like Minette de Silva or Ananda Kumaraswamy, who kind of bookend Wendt. Kumaraswamy passes away in 1947, Minette de Silva returns to Sri Lanka in 1948. Further work needs to be done in situating these figures and other artistic practitioners active at the time, working in different mediums, in not only attempting to appreciate the kinds of local veracities with which they were transacting and the worldly conditions they were inhabiting simultaneously, but to understand more clearly the range of modernity projects that were playing themselves out in the region. What makes Wendt noteworthy is his belief in the medium of photography, its potential in how it could be the ready receptacle of a person's own artistic vision, despite how complicated that might be, and furthermore, the way he utilized it to express his own ideological claims as well as personal struggles. The 1938 exhibition, I think, can be thought of as an illustration of this belief, and perhaps it's unsurprising that his conviction was not recognized at the time and found resistance for decades to come. Wendt's work has been exhibited quite seldomly in the West. There are actually pictures up on the walls of the Tate Modern right now, but that is only a recent acquisition, and something I can't build on is the history of the acquisition of photography from the region by major Western but also British institutions. Wendt passed away in 1944, and a posthumous exhibition of his prints was again held in London at the Asia Institute in 1950, along with the occasion of the publication of a monograph, Lionel Wendt's Salon. I'd like to end in conclusion by quoting quite liberally from a review that appeared in the Royal Photographic Society's journal from 1950 on the monograph. Edward Brumer writes, and I quote, the pleasurable anticipation of a feast of unusual and exotic pictorial photography turns to disappointment as the 251 pages are turned. The plates appear to be a mass of photographs gathered together without any set purpose. I cannot help but feel that this posthumous collection should never either have been attempted or published unless ruthlessly vetted by several recognized authorities. I'm sure the photographer himself would have discarded at least 2/3 of the photographs reproduced, since they're obviously of an experimental nature. Most photographs are of reasonable ability, with a flair for artistic individual expression. Produce pictures such as these in search for a personal method of approach, and destroy the majority when they have solved the problem, end quote. Brumer's critique is hardly a revelation after what we've heard over the last 2 days and what we see in the papers even today in the reception of non-Western art, and it is a reinforcement of a certain kind of expectation the West has of non-Western art, or art from South Asia. It is, to use his words, the problem inherent in them, which Brumer seems unwilling to confront, that precisely makes the exhibition of Wendt's pictures all the more necessary and urgent. Thank you.